In a matter of weeks, the task force has made the largest number of arrests of cartel leaders, operatives, and gang members in American history.
At exactly 4 a.m., Minnesota didn't wake up. It went silent. Streetlights dimmed. Radios crackled once, then went quiet. Within seconds, blackout helicopters sliced through the sky as unmarked federal convoys flooded into St. Paul and Minneapolis from every direction. No sirens, no warnings, only encrypted signals flashing across command screens as the final countdown hit 0. This was not a routine raid. This was the largest coordinated federal strike in Minnesota's history, a joint operation led by the FBI and DEA, targeting a criminal enterprise that had been hiding in plain sight for years. By sunrise, 197 suspects were hit simultaneously across homes, warehouses, and commercial sites. Federal agents seized massive amounts of illicit cash and uncovered evidence of a deeply organized logistics network embedded inside the Twin Cities. But what made this cartel truly dangerous wasn't just its size, it was how it operated. Behind ordinary lives and legitimate businesses existed a paramilitary-style structure, quietly woven into the daily rhythm of American cities. No flashy cars, no street wars, just discipline, planning, and silence. As breach teams kicked down doors in those final moments before impact, investigators knew this was more than a bust. If this network had slipped away, the Midwest could have become a major supply corridor for transnational crime. This is the story of how that threat was finally exposed. Before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe to Military Power, because what comes next reveals how federal law enforcement unraveled one of the most sophisticated criminal operations ever uncovered in the region. The investigation didn't begin with headlines or arrests. It began quietly, inside America's transportation backbone. Minnesota sits at a critical crossroads of logistics and commerce. Highways, rail lines, and distribution hubs connect cities like St. Paul and Minneapolis, turning the state into a vital artery for goods moving across the country. And that's exactly why it became the perfect hiding place. Small warehouses tucked into industrial zones. Anonymous box trucks making routine deliveries. Local businesses operating day after day with nothing seemingly out of place. But beneath that normal flow, something else was moving. Vehicles, drivers, and shipments that looked legitimate on paper were actually part of a growing web federal agents had begun tracking closely. This was not a loose collection of street criminals. Investigators identified a three-tiered organization, structured and disciplined far beyond typical crime cells. At the top, figures controlling financing and logistics. In the middle, managers directing money flows and transport routes. At ground level, couriers moving goods, cash, and communications across state lines with alarming regularity. Agents estimated nearly 200 individuals were tied to the network, each playing a defined role. Federal indictments would later describe it as organized criminal activity on an exceptional scale. And the money told the real story. Authorities traced an astonishing $652 million flowing through the group's financial systems, seized or identified through ongoing investigations. This wasn't petty crime. This was a financially sophisticated enterprise, operating at levels that rival established international syndicates. Charging documents and media reports linked the network to drug trafficking, large-scale cash movement, and complex money handling across multiple jurisdictions. Unlike traditional cartels focused solely on narcotics, this operation blended logistics, finance, and clandestine coordination into one seamless machine. What made the FBI and DEA operation extraordinary wasn't just its scope, it was the stealth. For years, this network avoided detection by rejecting the usual markers of criminal life. No public violence, no territorial disputes, no attention-grabbing displays of power. Instead, it hid inside the systems that keep America running, trucking routes, freight terminals, and routine money transfers that looked perfectly normal to outsiders. And that raises a chilling question. How could something this large exist for so long without being stopped? In a state where commerce never slows, criminals exploited the blur between legitimate and illicit flow. Front businesses, harmless-looking addresses, and clean paperwork acted as camouflage, frustrating traditional law enforcement methods. By the time federal agents moved in, they had spent months assembling a precise map of the network's reach, and they knew there would be no second chance. Surveillance, Financial tracing, confidential informants, and interagency coordination gave investigators the evidence they needed to move. That set the stage for the massive takedown. Simultaneous federal actions across the Twin Cities and beyond, arrests of nearly 197 individuals, and the disruption of a cash-rich enterprise that had quietly shaped a shadow economy under Minnesota's surface. The operation detonated across Minnesota with almost mechanical precision. Federal breaching teams moved at the same second in neighborhoods miles apart, forcing doors at private homes, warehouses, small offices, and high-rise apartments before anyone inside had time to understand what was happening. There were no rolling arrests and no gradual escalation. This was a synchronized strike designed to overwhelm the network before a single warning could travel through it. In residential streets, agents moved door-to-door with speed that suggested long rehearsals. In industrial zones, armored vehicles boxed in loading bays and storage units that had appeared harmless for years. At several locations, suspects were found asleep moments earlier. Yet, the response was not confusion or panic. Within minutes, armed resistance emerged. According to federal court records tied to the case, gunfire was reported at multiple sites during the initial entries, forcing teams to switch instantly from arrest mode to containment. This was the moment investigators had feared but prepared for. Rooftop overwatch units and snipers were already in position, scanning windows, stairwells, and elevated firing points. In at least one confirmed incident reported by local and federal sources, shooters attempted to fire from upper floors only to be pinned down by overwatch teams before the situation escalated further. The goal was control, not chaos. Every movement was measured, every corridor cleared with discipline, as if teams were advancing through hostile terrain rather than suburban streets. What stood out to agents on the ground was how quickly some suspects reacted. Doors barricaded from the inside, reinforced entry points, and coordinated attempts to delay breaching teams suggested planning that went far beyond spontaneous self-defense. Federal investigators later stated in charging documents that several locations showed signs of pre-positioned security measures, including lookout positions and controlled access routes. This was not random resistance. It followed patterns. As the operation unfolded, it became clear that this network had anticipated confrontation. At one warehouse location, evidence later showed that documents were being destroyed minutes before entry while encrypted devices were powered down in sequence. At another site, suspects attempted to regroup rather than flee, indicating internal rules about when to stand ground and when to retreat. These were not the actions of criminals improvising under pressure. They reflected rehearsed responses. By the end of the first wave of entries, dozens of suspects were already in custody. Yet the most unsettling realization was only beginning to take shape among federal commanders. The resistance they encountered did not resemble fear-driven violence. It resembled trained reflexes. Movements were deliberate. Communication was minimal but effective. Even under sudden pressure, certain cells reacted as units rather than individuals. This observation would later become a central theme of the investigation. According to statements released by federal prosecutors after the arrests, the network operated with a level of internal discipline rarely seen outside organized crime groups with paramilitary influence. While no formal military affiliation was alleged, the structure and behavior raised serious concerns about how such training or operational knowledge had been acquired. By sunrise, large sections of the network had been neutralized. But the most important insight of the morning was not the number of arrests. It was the confirmation that this group had prepared for exactly this scenario. The raid had not triggered panic. It had triggered a playbook. And that leads to the question that now sits at the center of this case. Who taught them to fight like this? And how long had they been preparing for a confrontation with the U.S. government? What truly changed the direction of the entire case did not happen during the gunfire or the first wave of arrests. It happened hours later inside an industrial strip on the edge of St. Paul, where federal teams pushed deeper into a location that had never appeared on any public radar. From the outside, the building looked forgettable. One more warehouse surrounded by loading docks and quiet service roads. Inside, investigators found something that instantly reframed the operation. Hidden beneath the surface was a multi-level underground command center, carefully concealed and designed to stay invisible from routine inspections. According to information later described in federal filings and summarized by U.S. media outlets covering the case, the space contained racks of servers, organized radio equipment, detailed planning boards, and handwritten schedules mapping deliveries across multiple states. The layout did not resemble a stash house or temporary meeting point. It resembled a control room. Whiteboards displayed routes, time windows, and coded identifiers. Radios were labeled by function rather than name. Power backups were installed to keep systems running even if the main grid failed. Investigators immediately recognized that this was not improvised infrastructure. It had been planned, built, and maintained over time. This discovery marked a turning point. What had initially looked like a large criminal sweep now appeared to be the exposure of a long-term operational headquarters. Federal analysts on site began comparing notes with early intelligence, and patterns quickly started to align. Reports from the Associated Press and regional outlets later confirmed that investigators believed the network had been operating quietly for years, embedding itself into local businesses, freight operations, and transportation routes without drawing attention. This command center was the missing link that explained how coordination had remained so tight while activity stayed largely invisible. For a brief moment, the case paused while teams documented everything. This was not just evidence collection. It was interpretation. In modern law enforcement, especially at the federal level, criminal organizations are increasingly judged by how they plan, communicate, and adapt. What agents saw here fit the profile of a new generation of organized crime. One that avoids open violence and instead mirrors the structure of professional logistics operations. This was not a loose collection of criminals reacting to opportunity. It was a system. The documents showed long-term thinking, including strategies for expanding influence through legitimate-looking enterprises. Delivery routes overlapped with real commercial traffic. Businesses were used as cover, not fronts that screamed criminal intent. According to summaries later released by prosecutors, the data suggested careful infiltration rather than sudden takeover. As analysts dug deeper, a more unsettling conclusion emerged. Minnesota was not the center of the operation. It was a node. The schedules referenced routes beyond state lines. Communications hinted at coordination elsewhere. Some digital records pointed to contingency planning, including relocation options if pressure increased. This was the twist investigators had not expected so early. The command center confirmed that the network had already planned for disruption. It had considered loss, arrests, and even forced shutdowns. That level of foresight signaled experience and external awareness. While authorities have not publicly identified how such operational discipline was acquired, federal officials emphasized that this was not accidental sophistication. It reflected deliberate learning and adaptation. By the time daylight reached the industrial belt of St. all the significance of the discovery was clear. The arrests mattered. The seized cash mattered. But the command center mattered more. It revealed intent, structure, and ambition. This was not about surviving on the margins. It was about controlling movement, money, and information over time. For investigators, the message was unmistakable. Taking down this facility had disrupted far more than a local network. It had exposed a blueprint, and that blueprint suggested the fight was not confined to one city or even one state. Minnesota, it now appeared, was only one piece of a much larger design. The question moving forward was no longer whether this network had been dangerous. The question was how far its reach extended and how many similar structures might still be hidden elsewhere, waiting to be found. After the doors were forced and the command center exposed, the case did not move forward with speed. It slowed down for federal investigators. This was no longer a chase. It became a rewind. Teams from the FBI and DEA began working backward through years of quiet activity, tracing how a criminal network had slipped into Minnesota without triggering alarms. What they found was not a sudden invasion, but a long, careful infiltration that unfolded almost invisibly. According to summaries later confirmed in federal court filings and reported by outlets such as the Associated Press, the network did not arrive as a cartel. It arrived as individuals. Drivers took ordinary jobs. Small businesses opened with clean paperwork. Warehouses rented space alongside legitimate tenants. Nothing stood out at first. Only when investigators aligned shipment records, financial flows, and communication patterns did the shape of the organization become visible. As the picture sharpened, a clear three structure emerged. At the bottom were low-level couriers and drivers. These individuals handled movement. They transported goods, delivered cash, and followed strict instructions without knowing the larger plan. If one was arrested, the damage stopped there. Above them sat managers who controlled money and logistics. These figures coordinated routes, handled payments, and ensured that every shipment blended into normal commercial traffic. They rarely touched contraband themselves. At the top was the most elusive layer. Investigators identified what prosecutors later described as a 9-member leadership council operating under aliases and rotating communication methods. These leaders did not give orders directly. Instead, they used intermediaries, encrypted platforms, and compartmentalized roles to keep distance between themselves and day-to-day operations. Even when arrest began, this top layer remained invisible. This structure explains why the network survived for so long. Traditional law enforcement operations often focus on visible crimes and immediate actors. This group was built to absorb losses. When a courier disappeared, routes shifted. When a business closed, another replaced it. The organization avoided violence whenever possible because attention was its greatest enemy. Federal analysts later noted that this model allowed the network to operate beneath the threshold that normally triggers large investigations. Financial data played a critical role in breaking that pattern by comparing banking records, cash movements, and property transactions. Investigators began to see connections that did not align with legitimate income. Media reports tied to the case stated that authorities identified hundreds of millions of dollars moving through accounts linked to the network, eventually leading to the figure of $652 million associated with its operations. This was the first sign that something far larger was hiding beneath the surface. Then came the turning point. The entire investigation was not triggered by a raid or traffic stop. It was triggered by anonymous messages. According to law enforcement sources cited by U.S. media, repeated tips began arriving with specific details about drop schedules, locations, and internal behavior. At first, investigators treated them cautiously. But when surveillance confirmed the accuracy of these messages, the case accelerated rapidly. These tips provided timing. They provided patterns. Most importantly, they provided intent. Someone with insider knowledge was feeding information directly into the federal system. That changed everything. Surveillance expanded. Warrants followed. Slowly, the structure began to collapse inward. Yet, the identity of the source remains unknown. Federal officials have not publicly confirmed who sent the messages or why. What is clear is that without them, the network might have continued operating quietly for years. The intelligence battle was not won through force alone. It was won because someone chose to speak. That leaves one final question hanging over this chapter of the story. Who decided to pull the FBI into this fight? And what did they stand to gain by exposing a system designed to stay hidden? The moment the first wave of arrests hit, the network did not collapse into silence. It reacted. Federal investigators later confirmed that within hours of the initial takedowns, encrypted communication traffic surged sharply, a sign that the remaining members understood exactly what was happening. Devices that had stayed quiet for months suddenly came alive. Messages moved fast, short, and coded, bouncing across platforms designed to erase themselves once read. In several locations, still under surveillance, agents observed rapid changes. Doors were reinforced from the inside. Entry points were blocked. Lookouts appeared where none had been before. According to reporting that followed the operation, some sites showed clear signs of emergency protocols being activated, including efforts to destroy paperwork and disable electronic storage before federal teams could arrive. At one location, investigators later recovered partially burned documents and damaged devices, evidence of a rushed attempt to erase history. There were also signs of attempted intervention. While no large-scale rescue succeeded, federal filings described movements by logistics crews trying to reposition vehicles and extract key individuals from known locations. These efforts failed largely because the network underestimated how quickly federal agencies could expand the perimeter once the operation was underway. Roads were locked down, traffic stops multiplied, surveillance tightened by the hour. Still, The network did not behave like an organization in panic. It behaved like one executing a fallback plan. Investigators later described this phase as a controlled withdrawal rather than a collapse. Communication shifted away from operational chatter toward contingency planning. Instructions focused on what to abandon, what to destroy, and what to preserve. That last part would prove critical. Despite attempts to wipe systems, federal cyber teams managed to seize a massive cache of digital data. Encrypted devices, servers, and backup storage recovered during follow-up searches revealed internal logs, schedules, and financial records that had not been fully erased. Media coverage of the case emphasized that this data became one of the most valuable outcomes of the entire operation, offering insight into how the network functioned beyond Minnesota. This phase turned the case into a race. On one side was the federal government, moving with legal authority, but limited by procedure. On the other was a criminal organization designed for speed and adaptation, able to abandon assets and shift routes without hesitation. Every hour mattered. If the network could reorganize faster than investigators could interpret the data, it might survive in another form. This is where the balance tipped. While the network had planned for arrests, it had not planned for the scale of coordination between agencies. FBI and DEA analysts worked around the clock correlating seized data with ongoing surveillance and financial tracking. What emerged was a clearer picture of interstate connections and possible international links. The organization was not improvising, it was relocating. Then came the most frustrating discovery of all. As arrest numbers climbed and evidence stacked up, investigators confirmed that the top leadership was gone. The 9-member council identified earlier did not appear in custody lists. Their devices were dark. Their known residences were empty. No public record showed where they went, only that they had moved early and decisively. Federal officials acknowledged this in post-operation briefings, noting that while the body of the network had been broken, its command layer had avoided capture. This was not a failure of the operation, but a reminder of the nature of modern organized crime. Leaders do not wait for confirmation. They disappear at the first credible signal. By the end of this chapter, the operation had achieved historic results. Nearly 200 arrests, hundreds of millions of dollars disrupted. A logistics empire exposed. Yet the final image is not one of total victory. It is one of motion. A network forced to scatter, its leaders in hiding, its future uncertain but not erased. And that reality sets the stage for the final question. When a system built on secrecy is cracked but not completely destroyed, does it rebuild somewhere else or does it finally collapse under its own weight? As daylight settled over Minnesota, the scale of what had just happened became impossible to ignore. Nearly 200 suspects were in custody. Hundreds of millions of dollars tied to criminal activity had been seized or frozen. And a network that had quietly operated for years across St. Paul and Minneapolis had been torn apart. According to reporting by major U.S. outlets such as the Associated Press and summaries released by federal prosecutors, this operation ranks among the most significant organized crime takedowns the state has ever seen. For the communities involved, the immediate threat was disrupted and a hidden system was finally dragged into the open. Yet, the story does not end with arrests and evidence rooms filled with cash and devices. The data recovered during the operation tells a more complicated truth. Investigators believe that while the Minnesota branch was broken, other segments of the network were already preparing to reorganize elsewhere, using the same playbook of silence, logistics, and patience. This is how modern criminal systems survive. They do not fight for territory. They move. From a U.S. perspective, this case stands as a clear demonstration of how federal law enforcement now operates in the face of these evolving threats. The coordination between the FBI and DEA, supported by financial analysts, cyber specialists, and local partners shows that success today depends less on brute force and more on intelligence, timing, and cooperation. This was not a single raid. It was a carefully synchronized campaign built on months of analysis. The core message is simple but unsettling. Crime today is no longer loud or obvious. It hides inside supply chains, businesses, and digital systems people trust every day. And that means the fight against it has become a battle of minds, not just muscle. So here is the question that remains. Do you think this operation was an ending or just the opening chapter of a much larger federal campaign across the United States? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Military Power to stay with us as we continue uncovering the hidden battles shaping the modern world.